I'm Jarad Daniels, CEO of the Global CCS Institute. For those of you who don't know much about the Institute, we're a leading international think tank with a mission to accelerate the deployment of CCS around the world as part of an effort overall climate change mitigation. Each year, we release the Global Status of CCS report, which tracks key developments for CCS in the previous 12 months. Today, I'll present the report, and we'll also hear 3 pre-recorded remarks from leaders around the world on how CCS is progressing. Given that there are well over 1,000 attendees on our session here in our virtual session today and limited time available, we will not be able to take questions and answers during the webinar. However, we encourage all of you to reach out to us at info@globalccsinstitute.com with any questions. Next slide. If I could have the next slide, please. The climate math is absolutely crystal clear. Carbon capture and storage, CCS, and carbon dioxide removal must both scale to gigatons per annum to mitigate climate change and to help us reach our global net zero goals and ambitions. The growing urgency to address climate change felt by policymakers, industry leaders, investors, and the general public is now accelerating CCS deployment in many regions around the globe. The CCS project pipeline has exhibited strong year-on-year growth over the last 6 years, growing at a compound rate of more than 35% per annum since 2017. The Global CCS Institute is now tracking 41 projects in operation and 351 in development globally, with new projects being announced weekly. The growing interest from CCS project developers is now palpable in many regions across industries and in diverse applications. As of July 2023, there are 392 facilities in the pipeline, representing a 102% year-on-year increase. The 41 facilities in operation have a capacity to capture and store 49 million metric ton per annum. Growth has been driven by strong policy, particularly in North America and Europe. In the United States alone, federal policy is unlocking the potential for hundreds of millions tons per annum of CCS capacity yet this decade. Support for CCS in Denmark is an example of how quickly and strongly enabling policies can be developed and implemented with strong public support. There's increasing diversity in CCS applications across industries. The ongoing development of CCS networks has resulted in a new industry category of CO2 transport and storage facilities in the Institute's data set for this year. We now have the largest number and total capacity of projects under construction in the history of the CCS industry. While this progress is encouraging, achieving climate targets will require annual CO2 storage rates of approximately 1 gigaton per annum by 2030 and multiple gigatons per annum by mid-century. So there's still much good work for all of us to do. As more projects progress from planning to development to execution phase, permitting, public engagement, and project management will increasingly become more critical for successful deployment. Institutional support and technical capacity building across the private and public sectors are urgently needed to facilitate permitting. Public engagement is essential for large infrastructure projects and will be critical for the build-out of CCS networks. The strong growth in the CCS project pipeline is clearly driven by strong policy. CCS is becoming a more prominent feature of public policy, from inclusion in a growing number of countries' nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to the provision of targeted policy to drive deployment and the drafting of appropriate regulations. As of July of this year, CCS is featured in 27 country NDCs. In addition, more stringent general climate policy and regulation is sending a very clear signal that the world is looking to expeditiously decarbonize across all sectors. Countries are starting to establish national CCS targets and roadmaps. Examples include in the UK, Japan, and in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Global collaboration on CCS has never been stronger, as demonstrated by the Carbon Management Challenge championed by the United States and a growing coalition of countries, which aims to deliver gigaton-scale CCS by 2030. International CCS business models are being developed, with the first transboundary movement of CO2 by ship for geologic storage completed between Belgium and Denmark this year. Recent growth in CCS project capacity has been concentrated in North America and Europe, where supportive policies or carbon pricing is the strongest, and comprehensive regulations are already in place. Recognizing the absence of CCS regulations is a critical barrier to investment in CCS, countries in the Asia-Pacific region are now actively developing regulations to enable a growing pipeline of project development. As previously mentioned, both the numbers and capacity of CCS facilities in the project pipeline are at an all-time high. We added 198 new CCS facilities to the pipeline in 2023. Since 2017, as I mentioned, the capture capacity has grown at an average rate of more than 35% per annum. This has accelerated in the last 3 years, where the annual growth rate has been above 45%. Capture capacity across all stages of operation and development increased by 50% from 2022, reaching 361 million ton, the largest capacity ever reported by the Institute. Most of this growth is from CCS projects in development, which grew by 47% this past year. Projects in advanced development have committed significant funds for engineering development and have a higher probability of progressing to construction. So in light of this, an increase of 47% is significant for future deployment. Note that to avoid double counting in the capacity, the pipeline chart does not include the capacity of the transport and storage projects that I mentioned. However, the number of facilities quoted and shown on these slides does include CO2 transport and storage facilities that do not have their own CO2 capture component. So we've seen 5 years of robust growth in CCS project pipeline. However, that growth is far from evenly distributed across the globe. Most of the CCS projects are being developed in advanced economies, especially in North America and Europe, where we, again, have strong policy and regulation that support a business case and drive investment. Projects in developing economies are far less common. It's clear from this map that South America, Africa, Central Asia have little to no CCS project development activity to date. However, it's encouraging to see project activity in developing Asia. And while the 102% year-on-year increase in the number of CCS projects makes a great headline, meeting global climate targets will require CCS deployment across the Global South. The U.S. still dominates CCS deployment, with 73 new facilities entering the pipeline this year in 2023. The UK, Canada, China, and Norway all increased their facility count and remain in the top 5 CCS deployment countries, as you see on this slide. The number of countries hosting commercial CCS projects in development increased by 11 to 37 countries now this year. Countries developing commercial CCS facilities for the first time in 2023 are Bulgaria, Croatia, Egypt, Germany, Greece, Japan, Libya, Oman, Papua New Guinea, Poland, and Russia. It's great to have the additional countries added to the list. The sustained growth in the capacity of CCS projects in development or construction, shown on the right of this slide, has not yet matched by similar growth in the capacity of operating facilities. Hopefully, we'll see that trend grow in the future. This is not surprising, given that projects can take on the order of 7 years or more to advance through studies, through construction, and to then commercial operation. And while not all the projects in the pipeline will ultimately succeed, we expect to see a significant capacity enter operation in the next 5 to 10 years. This is clearly evident in this chart that many of you have seen before, where most facilities in development are targeting the commencement of operations by 2030 now. The diversity of industries to which CCS is being applied has increased significantly from many years ago over the past several years, demonstrating its broad role in supporting net zero ambitions. the versatility of CCS. It's clearly on display here with application across multiple industries, including hydrogen and chemicals, fertilizer, iron and steel, cement, bioethanol, waste to energy, power generation, and direct air capture. It's also interesting to note that as time passes, CCS is being applied to industries with higher capture costs, such as in electricity generation, cement, or even direct air capture. This is a direct result of the steady reduction in those capture costs over time and the strengthening of business case for investment driven by policy. This chart also shows the birth of a new industry, the CO2 transport and storage industry. As of July of this year, there were 101 transport and storage projects in our project pipeline. Each of these projects aims to provide CO2 transport and storage services to third parties, leveraging the cost and risk advantages of networks in anticipation of robust future demand. Focusing on the capturing in the capture source of the emissions, the ethanol industry is the largest with 70 facilities. Power generation and heat had 53 in our data set. And finally, natural gas processing, which historically early on was the primary industry for CCS, currently has 45 facilities across our project pipeline data. Historically, a CCS facility was vertically integrated, a single CO2 capture plant with dedicated CO2 compression, pipeline, and storage systems. However, CCS networks are becoming the dominant mode of CCS deployment, according to our data. CCS networks involve capture plants utilizing shared transport and storage infrastructure. This map shows over 100 CCS networks in development. Each number is a separate network. For example, there are 7 CCS networks in development currently in Japan. Networks, where each entity typically operates only part of the full CCS value chain, provide several benefits. They reduce cost and commercial risk by allowing each company to remain focused on their core business and not extend into areas of operation in which they have lower competency. They create multiple service providers or customers, greatly reducing counterparty risk. And they create economies of scale that would not be available to any individual CCS project, reducing overall and per unit cost. CCS hubs are typically established in industrial areas where a number of large emitters are located and, as such, not only serve to accelerate emission reduction in hard-to-abate sectors and industries, but also contribute significantly to domestic regional economies. It's clear the development of CCS networks and hubs is critical for achieving the multiple gigaton levels of deployment all the climate math says is required by mid-century. A result of the emergence of these CCS networks is that CO2 transport logistics are now becoming more complex. Pipelines remain the dominant transport mode for projects in development. It's a mature technology. It's been in commercial operation, mainly here in the United States, for well over half a century. But there's a growing proportion which plans to use a combination of pipelines and shipping, or even barges, to collect CO2 from multiple sources and deliver it for storage. Shipping companies and shipbuilders are actively expanding their services into the shipping of liquefied CO2 in response to this demand. Shipbuilders including Hyundai Heavy Industries, Mitsubishi, Mitsui OSK, TG Marine, Daewoo Shipbuilding, Dalian Shipbuilding, and others are designing CO2 carriers with capabilities and capacities of up to 80,000 cubic meters. The preferred mode of geologic storage is also changing significantly. Currently, around 25% of the captured CO2 is injected for dedicated storage, with the balance being stored through enhanced oil recovery. However, the data show going forward, 78% of the total capacity of CCS facilities in development or in construction plan to use dedicated geologic storage. This is significant for 2 reasons. The first is that it demonstrates the revenues from enhanced oil recovery are generally becoming less important to the commercial viability of CCS investments. The second is that developers of dedicated geologic storage resources will seek to maximize their capacity to increase their economic value. This financial incentive is critical to drive the increased rates of storage resources and development required to meet our climate targets. In terms of financing and investment, CCS facilities are clearly capital intensive, and so the availability of financing is absolutely critical. Currently, CCS projects are generally financed by corporate balance sheets, as project finance is not yet widely available. For example, Exxon, Occidental, Denbury, each finance their CO2 pipelines and storage networks. Consistent with the observed growth in the project numbers, financing prospects have improved substantially in the past year in key jurisdictions, particularly again in North America and Europe, due to the increased policy support and other factors, including price signals, and there is every indication that this momentum will continue to grow. But it's worth noting that the increase is mostly in equity funding in developed economies benefiting from multiple revenue streams. There's also been an uptick in equity investment, mergers and acquisition activity, and some consolidation of CCS service providers. The most significant example being the acquisition of Denbury by ExxonMobil for $4.9 billion earlier this year. Denbury owns and operates CO2 transport pipelines and geologic storage here in the States. However, to reach the deployment required to support our climate ambitions and meet those net zero climate goals, project debt financing will need to be as common for these CCS projects as it is now for general infrastructure projects. And there's clearly much more work that needs to be done there for that type of financing all around the globe. If we go just for a high-level look now, region by region, according to the data that's in our new status report, let's touch upon the significant developments, starting with here in the United States. The U.S. is a leading, and a leader in the global landscape, the largest number of CCS projects and facilities in operation, in construction, and in development, which has increased this year by 73 since the publications of last year's global status report. Ethanol, ammonia, hydrogen, and fertilizer production, as well as power generation and heat, are the top applications the data show for carbon capture in the United States. Production of clean hydrogen and ammonia have become economically favorable in the new policy environment here, and it's reflected in several projects announced this year. The U.S.'s goal of carbon-free electricity by 2035 has turned attention to the potential for scaling up CCS at fossil fuel power plants. Development continues at 23 power heat facilities, more than half of which plan to be operational in the late 2020s. Ethanol production has driven a new tranche of announced projects in the States. CCS projects in cement, steel, and chemical production are also being developed. There's considerable geologic storage development activity as well underway in the United States. The Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, or PHMSA, continues to work on new rulemaking to update standards for CO2 pipelines, including requirements related to emergency preparedness and response. The U.S. EPA has received an unprecedented number of Class 6 permit applications. Their public-facing website now shows 169 wells associated with 58 projects as of last month, and that's publicly available on EPA's website now. However, this rapid increase in the number of applications for injection permits has put pressure on U.S. regulators, and permitting delays as well as lack of community support in some areas pose risks and headwinds to CCS developers in the United States. And so while he couldn't make it in person here today, we're grateful to hear now recorded remarks from the Honorable Brad Crabtree, Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management.
I'm Brad Crabtree, Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy. I want to congratulate the team at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute on their latest global status report. These annual reports are immensely valuable for those of us in government and for practitioners of carbon management in the private sector, for NGO advocates, and for the media. The report helps make sense of all aspects of carbon management, and it's indispensable in charting the extraordinary and welcome growth of this sector. As billions of dollars of public and private investment find their way into project development, we are seeing the number of carbon management projects in development, construction, and operation increase by almost 50% globally compared to last year. Currently, there are more than 40 carbon capture and storage facilities in operation, another 26 under construction, and well over 300 in development worldwide. Here in the United States, I'm happy to say that as of July of this year, 14 commercial facilities are in operation, another 8 under construction, and 73 in an advanced stage of project development. For those who would dismiss carbon management as merely a strategy for extending the life of fossil fuels or for encouraging additional oil production, GCSI's report tells a very different story. In the US, all carbon capture facilities currently under construction and the vast majority in advanced development are pursuing dedicated geologic storage of their carbon emissions in saline formations. This underscores the critical role that investors and industry see for carbon management in fostering decarbonization of energy and industrial production and helping to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. The unprecedented growth now unfolding in the U.S. is being driven by the robust federal policy framework of funding, financing, incentives that's been advanced by Congress and President Biden in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. It is also a tribute to the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and the many industry, NGO, and labor stakeholders who have worked for years to advance carbon management as an essential strategy for meeting our climate goals. So again, thanks to GCSI, and my congratulations on the release of this year's Global Status Report.
Elsewhere in the Americas, Canada's federal emissions reduction plan expects national CCS capacity to grow significantly, adding facilities to capture and store at least 15 million metric ton per annum by 2030. While a federally mandated carbon price is slated to increase to 170 Canadian dollar per ton by 2030. The federal government announced significant support for CCS deployment in its March budget, including an investment tax credit that will cover up to 50% of the capital cost of CO2 capture projects until 2030. The federal government released its carbon management strategy, which sets out a vision for carbon management technologies to be deployed to help achieve Canada's climate objectives, and includes a roadmap that illustrates a path to fulfilling this vision, including 2030, 2040, and 2050 milestones. In the province of Alberta, in addition to the 6 sequestration hubs agreements announced in the second quarter of last year, 19 further hubs have been awarded through the Provincial Technology Innovation and Emission Reduction Regulation mechanism. In Brazil, in August, a bill which would establish a legal framework for CCS in Brazil passed the Senate and moved through to the Chamber of Deputies. If approved, the bill would progress to the President for sanction. Also in Brazil, Petrobras injected 10.6 million ton of CO2 into the pre-salt reservoir last year, yielding an accumulated 40.8 million metric ton injected since their project operation began. This is the largest operating CCS project this year in 2023, and Petrobras has readjusted its target to re-inject 80 million tons cumulatively by 2025. We'll now hear short remarks from the Minister Rebecca Schulz, Ministry of Environment and Protected Areas from Alberta, Canada.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Global CCS Institute for having me to your wonderful event in beautiful Houston. I really wish I could be there with you in person today to get a little deeper into your exciting report. Clearly, carbon capture and storage is moving faster than ever, and its future is incredibly bright. There's no question that carbon capture is critical to our future, not only for reducing emissions, but also ensuring energy security and affordability for decades to come. As you know, Alberta is moving as fast as almost anywhere when it comes to this technology. We tapped into this incredible opportunity more than a decade ago and have been championing it ever since. As your report shows, Alberta's carbon capture activity is growing in leaps and bounds, and we're not alone. Global collaboration on carbon capture has never been stronger, and that's due in part to amazing leaders like the Global CCS Institute. Thank you so much for all the great work that you're doing to accelerate the global deployment of carbon capture. Together, we can help carbon capture scale up and reach unprecedented capacity in Alberta, the United States, and around the world. This report is a major milestone, and I do hope that our paths cross soon. Perhaps I'll see some of you at COP28 later this month. Thank you again.
Pivoting now across the Atlantic, there are more than 100 projects in various stages of development in Europe, representing more than a 60% increase since last year. As part of the Green New Deal industrial plan, the European Commission proposed the Net Zero Industry Act, or NZIA, in March of this year, which seeks to scale up technologies that will drive decarbonization, including CCS. In particular, the Act proposes an injection target of 50 million ton of CO2 stored per annum within the EU by 2030. Funding support through the Innovation Fund and Connecting Europe facility, as well as individual national subsidy programs, notably in Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and the UK, continue to support the business case for CCS deployment in Europe. In addition, the ETS price reached a new high of €100 per ton of CO2 in February of this year, contributing to an improved business case for CCS projects in some sectors. A number of bilateral agreements and declarations are being signed across Europe to facilitate cross-border collaboration and transportation of CO2. Specifically, Denmark and Norway are looking to position themselves as CO2 storage hubs for Europe. North Sea sites dominate CO2 storage in Europe still, but other storage opportunities are emerging in Bulgaria, Greece, Croatia, and Italy. Denmark and Poland are also considering onshore storage. Denmark continues to develop CCS regulations and move towards implementing with speed. It aims to become a European CCS hub with a total expected capacity of up to 52 million ton per annum by 2030 or 2032. The government is supporting CO2 storage and capture development through subsidies with €3.6 billion allocated for 2 tenders. The Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities selected Ørsted Bioenergy and Thermal Power for support of their capture and storage of at least 400,000 ton of CO2 per year starting from 2026 for 20 years. The UK government in its spring 2023 budget announced it will invest £20 billion in CCS with a target of capturing 20 to 30 million ton per year by 2030. The HyNet cluster in Northwest England and Wales, the East Coast cluster in Humber and Teesside were selected as part of Track 1 clusters, and the Acorn CCS project in Northeast Scotland and Viking CCS in Humber will form the next 2 clusters as part of Track 2. The Dutch government has continued to reward deployment of CCS in 2023, along with other green technologies, through its SDE++ subsidy. Following the positive court decision in August, the Portos project reached positive FID in October. The Aramis project that will offer CO2 transport infrastructure from Rotterdam to multiple storage fields in the high North Sea appears to be fully subscribed for the first 5 million ton per annum of CO2 capacity. Progress on Norway's full-scale CCS Longship continues. Norway's also started awarding other exploration and storage licenses to expand its CO2 storage capability to meet growing demand across Europe. France released its CCS strategy in northern summer of 2023 and notes that CCS could have the potential to capture and store between 4 and 8.5 million ton of CO2 emissions per year by 2030, whilst German government is developing its CCS strategy. Both of these countries are looking to introduce contract for difference mechanisms. And so now, last but not least in our virtual speaker lineup, we'll hear from Anders Hoffman, who's the IEA Governing Board Chair and Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities in Denmark.
Thank you for inviting me today. I'm Anders Hoffman. I'm Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Danish Ministry for Climate, Energy and Utility. Denmark's strategy for CCS. I think I will try to sort of sum that up in a why and how and a what. Let's start with the why. I think it's quite obvious for most of you viewing this, it's a very, very strong why. We need it in order to fight climate change. And I think we need it both at the global level to reach the Paris Agreement. We need it at the European level to have the very strong targets, the Fit for 55, very important component of that. And we definitely need it at the national level, given that Denmark has some of the most ambitious energy targets and climate targets in the world. So we need it for that. But we also need it for the longer run. Denmark has an ambition that in 2050, there will be a negative emission in Denmark. So we will actually capture CO2 from biogenic sources and put that into the ground and thereby creating a negative emission. So I think the why is quite strong, but it's also very important to remember that the why has to be combined with more solar, more wind, and more energy efficiency. Let's look at the approach. I think how we do it is really based on three main approaches. The first is this has to be a market-based approach. Secondly, we have to remember the value chain. And then thirdly, we have to work very, very closely with business. The market-based. I think from the very outset, all Danish policies, agreements, and all the text clearly highlights that this needs to be market-based in the end. So over time, costs will be reduced by innovation and economics of scale that would put the cost of CCS down. And furthermore, taxes and prices of quota would push up the demand and incentive to invest in that. Unfortunately, we are not there yet. So we need to have subsidy schemes that would sort of push the companies in that direction. So we need subsidies in the short run, but in a way that will push them towards the market-based solution. The value chain. I think we have looked at many other countries that have been working on them, and there tend to be sort of a tendency to either look at storage, look at capture, look at transport, and we really want to look at all of them together. You are not going to capture anything if you can't store it, and you will not invest in a storage if you do not have somebody capturing CO2. So the chicken or egg problem really need to be solved as part of the policies. Then finally, we do work very, very closely with business in Denmark, simply from the idea that they would see the problems much sooner than we will. It might be problems in other ministries' legislation. It might be regulation that hinder them in doing something. And with that very close dialogue, we can very quickly change the legislation and make sure that the market moves forward. So market, value chain, and speed, and company dialogue. Then finally, what have we done? I mean, there's been quite a lot of work in Denmark since the very early political agreement. That was in June 2020. Since then, we have increased, we have a subsidy scheme. A lot of money has been set aside for that. We have opened up for storage in the North Sea. There was a first storage of CO2 in the North Sea in the spring this year. We have negotiation with a lot of other countries. So now we have signed an agreement with Belgium and the Netherlands. So it's important that we can now transport CO2 between the three countries. And finally, we will very soon be opening up for the next round of licensing towards storage, which would be on land. And then after that, there would be another round of the subsidy scheme. So there's a lot of things going on the legislation, on the subsidies, and on the storage side. That was just very, very brief overview, but this just sort of sum up the why. Obvious, we need it in order to fight climate change. And the approach, we need to work with the market, we need to have the value chain, and we need to engage business. And then you need to do a lot of work very fast. Thank you for having me, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the speeches. Thank you.
Great. And just a quick thanks to our three virtual guest speakers and some great examples of the public-private collaboration in the Americas and Europe that are helping to advance CCS deployment in those jurisdictions. If we now turn our attention to the Middle East already accounts for 8% of global operating capacity and is now on the cusp of a remarkable uptrend driven by several factors. The first is climate targets. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have announced net zero targets for 2050 and 2060. The second factor is the emergence of low carbon hydrogen and ammonia as a fuel export market. With the abundant natural gas, geologic storage resources, and existing expertise, oil producers in the Middle East are positioning to become major suppliers to this market. There's also strong emphasis on sustainability and industrial diversification in the region, which is well aligned with the production of low carbon fuels using CCS. In the UAE, ADNOC CCS projects are being implemented in several stages, with 0.8 million ton per annum of CO2 captured in phase 1 at Al Rayada, the Emirates steel plant in Abu Dhabi. ADNOC estimates that phase 2 and phase 3 will capture approximately 5 million ton per annum of CO2 before 2030. In September of this year, ADNOC announced it took positive FID on the Habshan facility, which will form part of phase 2. The Al Jubail CCS industrial hub in Saudi Arabia will capture and store CO2 from industrial facilities, targeting 9 million ton per annum to be operational by 2027 and 44 million ton per annum at full scale in 2035. In a further demonstration of Saudi Arabia's commitment to CCS, the kingdom also joined the institute earlier this year. Moving our attention now to the Asia Pacific region, there is much activity on CCS overall. There are currently 12 CCS facilities operating in the Asia Pacific region, 8 in construction, and a further 34 in development. The total facility count increased from 20 last year to 54 in 2023. Facility development is being led by the oil, gas, and chemical industries, which have some of the lowest CO2 capture cost opportunities. Several gas industry-led projects are considering storing third-party CO2 in addition to their own as an additional source of revenue. Conversely, emitters in nations with limited geologic storage resources, such as Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, are starting to look for opportunities to export their CO2 for storage in other jurisdictions and countries. This will require the removal of legal barriers to the transboundary transport of CO2 for storage and the promulgation of CCS legislation where it's absent, which is the case for most of the countries in the region. Of the 12 operating CCS facilities in the Asia Pacific, 11 are in China. China also has 6 facilities now in construction, 3 in the chemical industry, 2 on the power generation, including the world's largest coal power CCS project, and 1 on iron and steel production. Japan announced a long-term CCS roadmap earlier this year and support for feasibility studies for 7 CCS networks that would service a range of industries from pulp and paper to power generation. 5 networks would use storage resources offshore Japan. 1 will store in Malaysia and 1 elsewhere in the region. Japan's roadmap sets a target for Japan's first commercial CCS facility to commence operation by 2030, on the way to storing 240 million ton per annum of CO2 by 2050. Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Brunei, Timor-Leste are all seeking to leverage oil and gas production expertise and infrastructure to establish CO2 storage projects to manage their own emissions and also to generate revenue from the storage of third-party CO2. In Australia, the Gorgon project continues to operate, storing around 1.6 million ton per annum of CO2. Santos's Cooper Basin CCS project is in construction with a capacity of 1.7 million ton per annum expected to come online next year. And the Australian government has introduced a bill to ratify the amendments of the London Protocol to allow transboundary transport of CO2 for storage. So hopefully the past several slides have given you a broad overview region by region of all of the activity progressing CCS around the world. There's tremendous ambition going into COP28 this year. The US, through the IRA, has given immense stimulus to carbon management. Numerous analysis shows the US will likely host between 200 and 250 million ton per annum of carbon capture capacity by 2030. The UK's CCS roadmap foresees 20 to 30 million ton per annum installed capacity by 2030. The EU needs to have 300 to 550 million ton per annum of installed capacity by 2050 to meet its net zero emission targets. The Net Zero Industry Act aims to have 50 million tons of storage again developed by 2030. Japan announced its long-term roadmap, as I mentioned, setting targets for their first commercial project to commence by 2030 and up to 240 million ton per annum mid-century. Saudi Arabia and Brazil have similarly ambitious targets. Globally, the CCS community is raising ambition, but there's still much work to be done getting us to that gigaton scale that all the climate math and analysis says we absolutely must achieve to meet our shared ambitions and targets. And so while there's good reason to be optimistic, scaling up CCS at this rate is far from assured. Reaching the required scale for CCS will require all of us to work together. The role of government is to put in place supportive policy that can help spur and drive investment. The role of finance sector is to provide the necessary capital, right? Private sector has to build, own, and operate CCS facilities at scale. Existing pledges and commitments, as discussed on the previous slide, if delivered, can deliver hundreds of millions of tons per annum of CO2. But in order to get to that gigaton scale that's required globally, deployment in emerging markets and developing economies must increase significantly. Capacity building, legal and regulatory framework development, and storage mapping are no-regret opportunities to accelerate deployment in these regions. For CCS to be scaled up to the level required, and the highest level of safety, environmental stewardship, accountability, community engagement, and societal benefits need to be incorporated into the projects. Climate justice and concerns of communities need to be central and fully integrated into policymaking at national and international levels. Achieving the 2030 level of global deployment will require, it's required, also hinges on cutting project lead times. The adoption of best practices and developing CCS hubs and clusters could help to shorten some of those times. Supportive policies that underpin more robust carbon values, compelling tax incentives, and facilitating CO2 transport and storage hubs to attract more local capture projects would help maximize the number of projects entering the development pipeline. So much work remains, but it does appear now that CCS is scaling up to 2030 and beyond. So with this concludes our briefing of this year's Global Status Report. I'd like to thank you for your attention and your interest in this body of work. The full report is available free for download from the Institute's website. If we can be helpful in any way to any of you, please let us know. That is our job, to be helpful to advance CCS globally. This now concludes today's virtual event. Thank you.